Hello and welcome back to another field trip, our final field trip for the quarter here at the North County, I keep calling it that, the North Campus Open Space on the west side of UC Santa Barbara. We're in the northwest corner of campus here, and this is now an open space. I used to be standing, where I'm standing now is probably the 9th fairway of a golf course. This property is the subject of a massive restoration effort that's been going on since, well, for a long time it's been in the plans and in the works, but since 2008 it's been officially going. It's now in a place where a lot of this wetland has been restored to what it once was. So in 1967, UCSB bought the lower Devereaux Slough. So that's the slough that you drive past when you're headed out if you park down at Coal Oil Point. So they bought it in 1967 and then made the Coal Oil Point Reserve down there. And this upper Devereaux Slough was all private land. It was private land until finally, I think it was maybe in the 70s, they decided to develop it into a golf course. So this was all a wetland up here, a soggy wetland. And so to make it into something that wasn't completely inundated with water, they just took soil from the sides of the property and dumped it all into the middle, which kind of raised the level and built a golf course. That golf course never really did all that well financially, even as much of a boom as golf had in the 70s and 80s. Partially because a lot of the portion of the year it would flood, because this is a floodplain. We're here in the Devereaux drainage here in the Devereaux watershed, and it would flood, rendering the course unplayable. And so UCSB and a lot of people at UCSB have had their eyes on this property for a long time, and people thought it would be a great candidate for a restoration project. And so it wasn't until kind of the early 2000s that the wheels started to turn on that. The golf course was failing, and so they became a willing seller. They just had to come up with the money. And being that this is such a great candidate for a restoration project, they were able to get it really well funded. And so there's a bunch of different funding sources that they got huge grants for, multi-millions of dollars, to take out the golf course, take out a bunch of soil from here, and then start this restoration project, which involved building a bridge, growing and planting hundreds of thousands of native plants, and it's really bouncing back, not only with the vegetation but also with the birds as well. There's 267 species of birds that have been counted here, and I know every year they're seeing new species that have come and established themselves. So this Devereaux watershed will fill up the Devereaux Slough every year, and in some years, if the rain is good enough, then that slough will break through at Sands Beach is where it'll open up, and so all the water will rush out. And at that point, you have a connection between the ocean and this freshwater wetland. And so then you get a mixing of both saline and fresh water. So there are some specific species that have been adapted to that, and you all went over those in the lagoon walk and talking about some of those species, and a lot of those species have established in here. So while that slough's open, you have exchange between the salt and fresh water. But for a lot of the year, especially around the wetland here, you have coastal scrub is kind of the dominant community, along with some chaparral and grassland. So it was the Trust for Public Land that eventually was the buyer of this property. They bought it and gifted it to UCSB, and UCSB was a perfect candidate to be stewards for this property, being that they have the Cheadle Center for Ecological Biodiversity, for SEBR. They're perfect stewards for it. Wayne Chapman and Lisa Stratton and people have been doing restoration for a long time, Carla D'Antonio. So them, along with Santa Barbara natives, like I mentioned, have grown hundreds of thousands of plants and planted them out here. And importantly, they try to focus on growing plants from seed that's collected right here, because because as you can imagine, plants, just like humans and just like animals, become adapted to their immediate environments. So if you went and got an Eskimo from Alaska and brought them down to the Sonoran Desert, then they would have a hard time surviving. And if you took a 19-year-old college student and put them up in the Alaskan wilderness, then they would have a hard time surviving because they are adapted to their environment, right? So, and that's even true within species of plants. So you can have poppies from further inland and poppies from the coast and transplant them, and they don't do so well because they have all kinds of adaptations to, maybe it's a saline environment, maybe it's different predators. There's all kinds of challenges that they've adapted to. So sourcing from local seed is something that's really important to this project. So we're just going to take a walk kind of around the path. This walking path is totally public, and it's a really nice walk, especially right now that things are popping up. Being that this is a restoration site, one of the biggest challenges is weeds and trying to knock those down. And they have put together some pretty heroic efforts to try and mitigate those, but it's still a constant battle. So we're standing right now in this big field of pretty much European crap. And there's a little bit of native vegetation that has taken hold, some saltbush down here. We learned another species of this at the lagoon, but we'll just jump straight into learning our first species of the day. And this is one that you probably all know already. You would definitely know it if you were on a hillside that was covered with it. But this is wild mustard and black mustard. It's Brassica nigra. So this is in the Brassicaceae, or the mustard family. Named 4 species like this. So Devin's got a close-up on the flower here, and so we've got a cluster of flowers and a raceme formation, and each one of these flowers is just classic Brassicaceae with 4 petals that are arranged in a cross formation. That's where you get those cruciferous veggies names. 6 stamens, in this case yellow petals, and these yellow petals are what are super indicative of driving in a California grassland, in a California hillside. The legend has it that it was planted by Spanish missionaries as they were establishing El Camino Real and establishing missions all the way up the coast of California. Legend is that they seeded this plant to kind of mark that road. So if you drive down Highway 101, which is mainly an El Camino Real now, you're going to see wild mustard coating the hills. And it gets to be really thick and really tall floral stalks here. So this is just the inflorescence. That's taller than me, and they get to be 10 feet or more. So before they shoot up this inflorescence, they will make a couple leaves down toward the base, but not much. And you can see that those leaves are already cooked by now. And then they'll continue to grow up, and they're making these cauline leaves, which are, you can call them simple, you can call them compound. They're kind of divided. This is one leaf here that we're looking at. That's a real classic Brassicaceae leaf with kind of some toothed margins and a little bit of lobing. And then of course this whole inflorescence that works its way up. This species is commonly mistaken for another mustard, another species in the Brassicaceae, which is actually in a different genus, and that's field mustard, or Hirschfeldia incana. And they can be distinguished by Hirschfeldia having a basal rosette of leaves and multiple floral stalks that come up, as opposed to this Brassica that has doesn't have that basal rosette. It just has one single floral stalk, even though that stalk is divided up. Brassica nigra is an annual, and Hirschfeldia is a perennial that grows back from that same base every year. The Brassicaceae, or the mustard family, is a hugely economically important family. A vegetables that we eat that are actually vegetables that come from the vegetative part of the plant come from the genus Brassica, and different varieties of the species Brassica oleracea, which give us kale, kohlrabi, broccoli, cauliflower, all kinds of other things. What else, Devin?
I was gonna say cabbage.
Yeah, cabbage.
A couple others too.
Yeah, there's plenty of different varieties that all come from the same species of Brassica oleracea. All right, I think I've talked us all enough about Brassica nigra. All right, we just came into a nice little zone of review plants here. So we've got this one, which you should know pretty much right off the bat, at least what family it's in. And then once you see these little tiered clusters of flowers, then you have a good idea of the genus. If you were here, you would rip off a leaf and smell the deliciousness of it. And you would see that the leaves are opposite. They have square stems. And then we're looking at the flower here, and it's this beautiful lavender purple color. So this is, you guessed it, Salvia leucophylla, which means white leaves, but referring to the whiteness of the leaves, but the common name purple sage is referring to the color of the flower there. We've got Salvia leucophylla, we've got this big old native grass back here, and this one is much bigger than I am, which is kind of uncommon for grasses in general, but this is Elamis condensatus in full bloom, giant wild rye. We love Elamis condensatus. And then we've got this one that we learned at Arroyo Hondo, this aster that makes these clusters of heads, and the heads are real packed together, hence the name Eriophyllum confertiflorum. So Eriophyllum meaning hairy leaves, and confertiflorum referring to the tight cluster of yellow heads there. And then we got this big old bush over here. Something that just looks like a freaking plant, I would say. So, all right, it just looks like a plant, meaning it's got simple alternate leaves, like most plants have simple alternate leaves. But where are we? We're in a place that I mentioned before is a pretty saline environment, right? So we can start to narrow it down. We can see that the leaves are pretty gray, and when I rub my finger against them, they are that silver color is not coming off, indicative that these are hairs. We don't have any flowers on this right now, but this could really only be one thing, and that's saltbush, right? This is Atriplex lentiformis. And then just right down here, you've got some beautiful flowers of what I keep calling mimulus, which you'll probably see if you go to look this up, because the genus was recently changed to Diplicus. This is Diplicus aurantiacus. And we can do the fun little trick of touching the sensitive stigma there and it closing right up. Thought to prevent these things from pollinating themselves as the bees make their way in and are moving around. It'll close up so it doesn't get its own pollen on itself. Diplicus aurantiacus. All right, nice little review session there. Did you know that California has a state grass? Well, we do, and this is it right here. California state grass is not something that just pops up in the late winter and sets a bunch of seed and takes over an entire hillside. That wouldn't be a great grass for California now, would it? California state grass is this rugged, drought-tolerant, long-lasting, deeply rooted bunch grass, perennial bunch grass. And so it's in the grass family, of course, Poaceae, but it's in the genus Stipa. And we're just going to hold you responsible for that genus Stipa. And this is Stipa pulchra, or purple needlegrass. You can see why it gets its name if you look at the flowers here. So these flowers are this beautiful, elegant purple color in these multi-stalked inflorescences. So we've talked a little bit about grasses and their morphology, and they're just messed up and hard to identify. Grasses are just notoriously tough to identify because they're just sort of unremarkable usually, although Stipa pulchra and stipas in general are pretty easy to tell apart because of that bunch that Devin just focused in on, as well as this beautiful purple color. And there's another invasive European species of annual grass that looks kind of similar to this, although it's not nearly as beautiful and elegant. And you can always tell the difference between the two when you run your finger down from the distal end of the flower down to the proximal end, and you can run it down perfectly smooth either way, and that's because there's not little barbed hairs on there that are preventing your hand from running down this way. That's one way to know that you're looking at Stipa pulchra here. So these perennial bunch grasses can get chomped down by native wildlife, and they can withstand long periods of drought because of their deep roots. They can withstand really harsh soils, like in fact our state rock is serpentine, and serpentine soils are normally super toxic to plants because they are high in heavy metals, and Stipa pulchra has no problem handling that at all. This is a great plant, and I'm glad that you finally know it. Initially caught our eye, of course, is the showy one here, or this lupin in the genus Lupinus, and we know that. Well, here's a really nice clue that we're in the pea family here, with this fruit that will dry at maturity and split on both sides. So this is our legume here, and then these flowers with the classic pea morphology, or Fabaceae morphology. And now we know we're looking at a lupin because these flowers are kind of tiered up toward the terminal end of this stalk. We've got palmately compound leaves. This particular species is Lupinus succulentus, if I'm not mistaken. And now that we got down here, we can see that growing out of this lupin, there's some Stipa pulchra right next to Bromus diandrus, I believe, or maybe Bromus rubens, but you can see that they look pretty similar, especially the untrained eye. And this one I can run my thumb up and down, no problem. And this one I can run my thumb one way. When I try and pull it back, it gets stuck, and I'm just crushing the flower. So this is an introduced species of grass from Europe that is a really bad weed, and unlike the bunch grasses of Stipa, these just kind of create carpets and take over entire hillsides. So minus the bromus here, this is what a California hillside may have looked like a couple hundred years ago before European settlers came. All right, so this isn't exactly the most glorious specimen that we're ever going to see of this one, and that's because, as you can see, this is part of the restoration project, which I think is kind of cool to see anyway. But as you're seeing, we're up at the very north end of the slough here. So this is the north end of the wetland. This is the Devereux watershed that will drain into this wetland right here in the northern end of the North Campus open space. And being that we're in a wetland, some plants that may have occurred here natively would have been things like the willows that you're seeing down there, the sycamore that they've planted, and this species here, which is also in the willow family. It's also in the Salicaceae, and this is a relative of aspens. If any of you are from the Rockies or anywhere east of, I guess, coastal California, then you start to get into aspens. And so this is in the genus Populus. Populus trichocarpa is the species. Trichocarpa means hairy fruit, and these things, hairy fruit, will help them float on the water and float down streams and rivers and things that they occur next to. This is the black cottonwood, and there's another species of cottonwood California, that's real common. This is a Fremont cottonwood. And a pretty good and easy way to tell them apart is just by the leaves. So they've got simple alternate leaves, which is kind of the go-to as far as plants go. And, and you can see that there's a little bit of kind of serration on the margins there. But the tell between Fremontii and Trichocarpa, or Fremont cottonwood, and the black cottonwood is the black cottonwood at the leaf base, that angle is acute, and rather than being real flattened and making more of a sagittate leaf as you would see in the Fremont cottonwood, the black cottonwood is more of an ovate base there. So these trees can grow, you know, up to 80 or so feet tall. They are deciduous, so they drop their leaves in the fall, and they're also dioecious and wind pollinated. Males drop some pretty inconspicuous catkins of flowers, and females do the same thing. Those female flowers, or the ovaries within them, will develop into capsules, or fruit that's dry at maturity that will open on one side. So this is Populus trichocarpa, or the black cottonwood. All right, so hopefully the audio is okay. There's a hero behind me that's doing a crazy amount of weed whacking that day, and that is a chihuahua barking at me and probably Blue here. But there's just another opportunity to do some other nice riparian species here. This one that's kind of getting macked on a little bit, but we're down in a riparian area. We're seeing simple alternate leaves where the ab and adaxial sides of the leaves are different colors. The distal end of the leaf is wider than the proximal end of the leaf. Yeah, this is Salix. This is in the genus Salix in the Salicaceae. And we pointed it out just a second ago when we were talking about that cottonwood. Here's that cottonwood we just talked about. They are pretty appropriately planting some other riparian species like Platanus racemosa. This is what just a young little California sycamore looks like. And the hope is that one day this thing will be 150 feet tall and 3 feet wide in diameter. As we go a little further up the bank here, there is one other species that can be a pretty tough one to tell, and it's not super common until you get down into riparian areas. Even in Santa Barbara, you're not going to see it everywhere. But again, simple alternate leaves. So you might think it's some kind of willow until you get real close to the leaves and see that there's some toothing around the margin. And you see that toothing around the margin, and this is sort of a elongated version of coyote brush. It's in the same genus. This is Baccharis salicifolia. Salicifolia, of course, meaning leaves that are like plants in the genus Salix. And so this is an aster riparian Baccharis salicifolia, or mule fat. So you probably wouldn't just know this plant by looking at it. Sort of inconspicuous, although when you've seen enough of them, then you know. And I just want to show it to you in its pretty good looking vegetative state here. So simple alternate leaves for the 400th time. But these leaves are really broad and big, kind of maybe sagittate, cordate looking, definitely very glaucous. This is tree tobacco, or Nicotiana glauca, that has yet to shoot up its big old floral stalk. So there's a couple of review plants over here. We just went over Baccharis salicifolia. Here's another species of Baccharis. This is Baccharis pilularis. That will show up in disturbed areas all over, even though it's a native plant. It's often referred to as the freeway plant because it'll pop up in disturbed areas like freeways. Hey, Blue. Blue, come here. Blue! Hey, Blue!
You're rolling.
Okay, guess what? a plant with green, simple, alternate leaves again. And this one might be tough to tell, but these leaves you might be getting kind of used to now. They look somewhat similar to your tomato plant. They're definitely, this is definitely in the Solanaceae. We've learned two plants in the genus Solanum. This one has small white flowers, and so this is definitely Solanum douglasii. And we have some fruit developing back here, which is still mostly green, but we do have some mature ones that have gone to this black color. This is the black nightshade. Solanum douglasii, named after our crazy ass buddy, the Scottish botanist David Douglas. Right next to this nice Solanum bush, we have our next new native plant species to learn. And this one is in a new family that you're not responsible for. It's Urticaceae, and this is Urtica dioica. Urtica dioica, this is stinging nettle. Some of you may have had some experience with stinging nettle. It's one of the few hazards we have in California out in the wild. The hazards we have you can kind of name on one hand, and neither of them are all that severe. We got rattlesnakes, which mostly leave you alone unless you step on them. We got ticks, which are kind of a bummer, but mostly don't have Lyme disease. We've got poison oak, which is actually pretty gnarly, and then stinging nettle. And you might come across stinging nettle if you're looking for a good fishing spot and you're in a riparian area and you have to walk through and do some bushwhacking, then you might end up walking through some stinging nettle. I know I've definitely done that my fair share of times. But simple leaves, and we've got opposite phyllotaxy here with really toothed or serrated margins. And you can see that there's a bunch of hairs on them. They're folded up like a taco, which is a way to kind of reduce transpiration and the heat here. They're right on the edge of the wetland here, and so this is kind of on the drier end of places where that you would see them. So if we do a close-up on the hairs here that are covering the stems and the petioles and even the underside of the leaves, those hairs are actually, they're modified epidermal tissue that are pretty tough hairs that have been modified into basically these hypodermic needles that have aqueous compound down at the base of them. That there's basically like a little microscopic bulb down at the base that have a compound that causes a histamine reaction in skin. So if you touch it, then that little needle will go into your arm or wherever you brush up against it, and the needle will basically, the pressure of you pushing against the needle will cause the bulb to squeeze, and it'll push that juice into your skin, and your skin will have a little bit of a histamine reaction to it, which isn't all that intense. It can hurt, and they can be more or less potent at different times of the year. Typically, the skin on your hands, your fingers, is tough enough that you can just grab it, and that's not really piercing the skin of my fingers. It doesn't really hurt at all. But I used to TA with the author of our textbook a lot, and he would usually grab a piece of stinging nettle from somewhere and then bring me up to the front of the class and do a little demo and see what it looks like when you get a stinging nettle rash. And so I'll just do one little example of that now. It's all for the kids. It's all for fun.
For the kids.
Doesn't really hurt that bad. So yeah, it just kind of makes you feel alive a little bit. And you can see, so I marked it all over there, and we'll see what kind of reaction I get, but it'll take place over the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes. So maybe by the time we get to the next plant, then we'll get to see what a stinging nettle rash looks like. I'm okay.
Brave man, brave man.
All right, so we learned this big boy over here Brassica nigra earlier, and just wanted to review this plant here, which you can tell is in the same family. This is in the Brassicaceae for sure. It's making that cruciferous 4-petaled flower, 6 stamens. The leaves even look similar to the Brassica nigra back here. This one though is from an earlier field trip, and this is wild radish, or Raphanus sativus. And I've known people, especially in Mexican cuisine, who will take these and throw them in tacos, and they do kind of taste a little bit spicy like radish does, but they're pretty good. And so the flowers can be okay, so
Did happen.
the flower color can range from white like this all the way to a really pretty lavender. So another Brassicaceae weed here, and as I'm looking down, I'm noticing that I'm getting a reaction from that stinging nettle, and it does sting still. It feels like a histamine reaction or like a bee sting, but it's subsiding. But my body is doing a little bit of an immune reaction, thinking that it's been stung, but as you can tell, I'm still fine, so nothing to be too afraid of, but something to be respectful of. Plant that is definitely in the Brassicaceae, right? You got those 4 cruciferous petals. They're yellow, so you might think that this is like maybe a little baby Brassica nigra, but then you look down and you see this basal rosette of leaves, and you see these multiple inflorescences coming up from the same plant. And so this is not Brassica nigra, it's a relative of it, it's in a different genus. This is that Hirschfeldia incana that we were talking about before. So this is a perennial Brassica, or perennial Brassicaceae rather. And then over here we've got some European grasses that have come up, and this one we learned on an earlier field trip as well, but I just wanted to show it here in full bloom with some nice beautiful purple stigmas coming out. And so the leaves working their way up the stem of this grass are all in a single plane. You can see that they're all in the same plane. I can even see salt crystals forming on the leaves there. So this is a salt excreter. It pumps sodium chloride out of its leaves, or I guess rather mainly sodium out of its leaves, to prevent the toxic levels of it in this super saline soil here on the north end of the slough. So this is saltgrass, or Disticus spicata. And if you're from the desert, or if you ever go out to the desert or Carrizo Plain or anywhere that also has saline soils, then you're going to see a lot of these plants that you also see in the salt marsh, like that you saw at the lagoon. So you'll see fleshy jaumea, you'll see saltgrass like this, or salty Susan, I forget what we called it for you, but nice little review plant there. Okay, so I know we already reviewed Solanum douglasii at length. Oh, covered with aphids in here, some gnarly black aphids and ants all over it that are farming those aphids, because the aphids are tapping into the sugar of the stem, and the ants will then drink the sugar water out of the aphids' butts. So the ants farm and protect the aphids. That's not why we're here though, because we were just walking by and Devin noticed this thing. He's like, whoa, this is a huge red fruit coming off this solanum. It turns out this is a different solanum. This is the tomato that we eat. So Solanum douglasii right next to an edible tomato right here, with a tomato already ripening on it. And this is probably where all those aphids came from. Solanum bradas. Okay, digging through the Atriplex here to get to this next European weed that we're going to go over, that makes these big compound leaves that are singly compound, bipinnately compound, tri-quad, whatever you want to call it. They're heavily compounded, and that is characteristic of plants in the carrot family. So we're in the Apiaceae here. This is one of your plant families that you're responsible for knowing, and this is fennel. Funiculum vulgare, and it's a common vegetable eaten, and actually the leaf bases are typically eaten. I don't think I'm going to be able to get to it, but we're looking at cauline leaves here, leaves made along the stem, but for varieties that have been selected to make a bunch of leaves down at the base, they've been selected to where this base of the petiole or sheath that it makes around the stem becomes really thick and succulent, and they taste super good. It's a really nice vegetable to go buy and try and cook if you haven't before. So it is used for cooking, even the leaves, because they have this kind of licorice smell to them, so often used for as an herb or an additive to cooking. They will eventually make a big umbel of umbels with yellow flowers and die off for the year and continue to grow back from the same stock. This species, remember, looks pretty similar, at least superficially, to a species that we learned at Arroyo Hondo, which was poison hemlock, Arconium maculatum. And this species here, as you're seeing on the stem, does not have any of those purple spots along it. Also, the leaflets here are not flattened blades like they are on conium, but rather just kind of little stringy forks like you would see on California sagebrush. So this is fennel or Funiculum vulgare. Our last plant for the field trip today is another one in the Solanaceae. So these leaves look like Solanaceae leaves for sure, simple alternate leaves. These particular ones have kind of a silvery look to them, which is due to the fine hairs on both the stem and the leaves. And so this plant is a perennial, it's pretty low growing herbaceous perennial that grows close to the ground here, and almost like a vine somewhat, and can create a little bit of a thicket. This is a nightshade. I'll tell you the name of it now, which is Datura wrightii, or Jimson weed. And it is characteristic because of the leaves here for sure, but also the flowers. And this flower is unopened. There's a bunch of flowers that are about to open on this thing. When they do open, they're going to be a pretty brilliant cream colored white with lavender on them. They're super, super beautiful. But again, like all Solanaceae plants, they have 5 fused petals in a tube like this. 5 stamens in the middle, these kind of beautiful big white stamens. And then the fruit will develop into a spiky ball, basically, that will split at maturity. And so this is one of those Solanaceae species that makes a capsule. This plant was actually important to Shumash and was used in ceremonially, actually. Like most plants in the Solanaceae, it's toxic to humans, it's poisonous, and like most plants in the Solanaceae, it will give you about the highest high you've ever had and hallucinations right before you die. And so this plant was used as kind of a rite of passage for young men that would eat, I can't remember what part of the plant that they would make a tea from, and it caused them to hallucinate and basically go down a spiritual journey. And then if they came out of that, then they were a rightful man. And in some cases that led to people dying. In some cases that led to people having a screw loose for the rest of their life. But in any case, this is an important religious plant for the indigenous people. Datura wrightii, Jimson weed. Don't eat it. All right, we hope you enjoyed the trip through North Campus Open Space, and now hopefully you have a little bit more of an appreciation for this land that UCSB takes care of and owns, and it's such a nice place for you to come and visit, especially after a good rain, when this whole wetland fills up and the birds come, and it's just a really nice place to be. So that pretty much wraps it up. You're getting a nice view looking towards Sands Beach, toward Devereaux Point, going straight south there because we're in Santa Barbara and the coast is weird. We worked our way up west down the path, and now we're making our way back to the cars over on the east side of the property. So on behalf of myself, Blue, and Devin, Natalie, I want to thank you guys for such a wonderful quarter and for coming along on these virtual field trips with us. You could have very well took this as an opportunity to just complain and have it be another challenge that gets you down, but you all overcame it, made some beautiful field notebooks that you should be really proud of, and I hope you all get an opportunity to come out and see these places in person. Hopefully we all get a chance to meet in person at some point. But just want to say thank you and have a great break.